A vanished picture, an empty frame, and too many questions. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. I'd love to know where you're joining from. Drop it in the comments. Your words always bring this mystery to life. Let's begin. The rain had been steady since dawn, a fine drizzle that blurred the lamps along Boulevard Richard Lenoir and left the cobblestones gleaming with a pale, uncertain light. Maigret stood by the window of his office, his heavy frame silhouetted against the glass, a pipe balanced in one hand. He wasn't thinking about police work just then. His mind lingered on Madame Maigret's voice that morning, patient but insistent, as she reminded him to have his overcoat brushed properly before Sunday. She had planned for them to visit her sister in Meaux, provided the weather allowed it. The domestic detail floated in his thoughts, incongruously soothing against the muffled noises of the city outside. The office smelled of damp wool and tobacco, familiar, almost comforting. On his desk lay the usual folders, each one a crime reduced to neat pages and official stamps. He hadn't touched them yet. Instead, he watched the street below, where people hurried along with their collars up and newspapers held over their heads, each rushing towards something unseen. It was the telephone that stirred him, its bell flat and insistent. Maigret turned slowly, as though reluctant to be disturbed from his reverie. The voice on the line was clipped, belonging to an inspector from the 11th arrondissement, someone young, unfamiliar. A petty report, Maigret thought at first, but the man sounded hesitant, unsure of how to phrase what he had found. "A burglary, Chief Inspector," the young man said. "Though nothing valuable seems missing, the owner insists it was a picture, a painting, not the canvas itself, only the photograph that was inside the frame. The frame was left behind." Maigret tamped his pipe with a thumb, not replying. Right away. He had heard stranger things in his career, and often it was in such odd, apparently meaningless details that the threads of human weakness began to unravel. He asked a few perfunctory questions: the address, the name of the complainant, whether there had been any signs of forced entry. The answers were uncertain, evasive even. Perhaps the young inspector didn't quite know how to make sense of it. Perhaps there was nothing to make sense of at all. When he hung up, Maigret remained seated at the edge of his desk, staring at the smoke rising lazily from his pipe. A missing picture, not a stolen jewel or a wad of notes. It stirred something quiet in him, not urgency, but a sort of curiosity that was half instinct, half weariness. He had learned after years of cases that began as trifles and ended in tragedy that one never knew where a faint crack in the surface might lead. Later, as he buttoned his coat and stepped out into the rain, he moved without haste. He knew already that this was not an affair the papers would ever sensationalize. There would be no dramatic arrests, no speeches for the prefecture. But something in the way the young inspector's voice faltered had convinced him it was worth looking at. The street smelled of wet pavement and coal smoke. Passing a cafe, Maigret paused long enough to glimpse the fogged windows, the silhouettes hunched over their morning glasses of white wine. The warmth inside tempted him, but he pressed on, pipe clenched firmly between his teeth. At Rue du Chemin Vert he found the house, modest, 3 floors, with peeling shutters and a door swollen by rain. An ordinary place, yet already the drizzle. And the silence about it seemed to whisper of something unsettled. He rang the bell, his heavy hand pressing firmly, and listened for the hesitant footsteps within. What he felt then was not excitement, but the slow stirring of recognition, that faint unease in the ordinary, the hint of a story beginning where most would see only rain and silence. The footsteps were slow, pausing just before the latch, as if the person inside wanted to arrange her face before opening the door. It swung back to reveal a narrow woman in a wool cardigan, its elbows polished with wear. She had the sort of tired prettiness you see in women who do everything themselves: cook, carry coal, talk to tradesmen. Her hair was pinned up hastily, and behind her, Maigret smelled boiled coffee that had gone a little bitter on the stove. "You are Maigret, police judiciaire." He lifted the corner of his card and let it drop back into his pocket. "You called about a picture." Her relief was real and vague at the same time. She stepped aside, and in the hallway, the runner was damp in patches from umbrellas, left moments too long before being shaken. A wooden stand held two umbrellas, a woman's with a crooked handle and another better one, black, with a whalebone tip that looked almost new. The young inspector was waiting in the parlour, almost at attention, the nervousness of a man who had arrived at the answer before he knew the question. He introduced himself as Vernou. Too clean a collar. A light smell of hair pomade. Nothing is forced, he said. No lock, no window. The frame is there, Chief. Only the picture is gone. The room was square, low-ceilinged, curtains heavy, enough to keep the street from entering. On the mantelpiece, between a vase of paper flowers and a clock that ticked a little too loudly, a frame stood open like a book, its hinged back let down, the frayed velvet backing showing the ghost of a rectangle. The glass was clean, a little too clean. Someone had wiped it and left fine lines in circles like the swirls women make when they clean mirrors with a towel. On the table lay the little brass tabs, bent back and not yet pressed in again. It was the painting stage after the actors had gone home. Maigret sat without asking. He had a way of sitting that made rooms smaller. The woman hovered with her hands at her apron, then folded them, then let them unfold. Madame Javet, Marthe Javet, you live alone here? Since my husband died. I have a room I let to a clerk, Monsieur Collin. He's harmless. He's at the office by 8. The picture. She swallowed. It was a photograph, old, of my brother in uniform. She stopped and the room heard the clock. From the war, it isn't valuable, only, well, to me. Vernou looked from her to Maigret as if to say, you see, sentimental, the sort of thing we cannot put in a report without sounding foolish. When did you last see it? Maigret asked. Last night. I dusted a bit before supper and set it straight. I always keep it straight. Her mouth twitched on the word always, and he noticed the cloth on the chair by the window, still damp at the corner. She had cleaned again after the thing had happened or because of it, tidying to hide something or to have nothing left. To hide. You lock the door when you sleep? Of course. Who has a key? Only me. And Monsieur Collin for the upstairs. But my door, he doesn't. She hesitated, as if she heard herself becoming unconvincing. The concierge? In case, for the gas man, you know. A little sound from the kitchen, water boiling too long somewhere. Maigret watched her not go to it. People who worry about kettles do not let them sing like that. He looked instead at the mantel clock. On its face, a faded maker's name from the Murrays. Someone had wound it this morning because the key lay nearby with a fingernail's worth of dust rubbed away where fingers had taken it. Show me the windows, he said. She led him. They were latched and wet on the outside, the thin film of rain like sweat. The narrow courtyard below was glazed with puddles, the gutters in the stone steps shining dark. No one had gone out that way without leaving marks on the sill, and there were none. They went back to the parlour, and he stood before the frame, not touching it. You said a photograph, he said. Inspector Vernou told me you had said a painting on the telephone. Her cheeks coloured with shame that had nothing to do with lying. Perhaps I said it foolishly. I was excited. It's a picture to me, you see? One says what one says. He didn't pursue it. Words people grasped at in the first hour were rarely the ones they chose the second hour. He turned to the umbrellas. The good black one had a rubber band still tight on it from the shop. Madame Javet followed his glance. That belonged to your husband? He asked quietly. To... She looked, then looked again, and the idea of claiming it as old died in her mouth. No, it is not mine. Whose then? I don't know. Perhaps someone left it. Yesterday a friend of the lodgers... No, that's nonsense. I don't have friends here. Her hands had begun to rub each other, a dry sliding sound. Vernou scribbled something that he thought would look like work later. Maigret went to the table. There were 2 cups, not one, on the tray. One had a tiny rim of lipstick, not fresh, not in a colour Madame Javet wore. Hers would be none. Women like her did not waste on paint. The saucers had rings dried nearly invisible. The tray was placed on the table in such a way that one could pretend it had not been there a minute ago. Madam, he said, did you have a visitor last night? She shook her head too quickly. No. If you did, it would not be a crime. People visit. We are in Paris. I said no. He nodded as if she had said yes, and let silence rise to the ceiling. A delivery cart rolled by in the street below, and splashed water against the curb. Somewhere a radio whispered a dance tune, thin as sheet metal. Silence did what questions could not. It made her feel his presence, his patient weight. At what time did you notice the picture gone? He asked almost kindly. This morning, she said after a long swallow. Before 8. I wanted to dust again. I had not slept well. Because of the rain, one hears it and thinks of things. He did not ask which things. He turned to the hallway and, with a glance, sent Vernou down ahead to speak with the concierge. While they were alone, he looked at the photograph that was no longer there. When objects were missing, their spaces spoke. The rectangle's paler patch told him the picture had been there a long time, so long that the paper beneath had kept its color. But there were faint, newer marks at the corners, as if not long ago the picture had been taken out and put back again, and whoever did it had pressed harder that time. He bent to the mantel and smelled the glass. It had the faint, clean smell of a towel that had dried by the stove, not of a rag kept under the sink. He touched the towel on the chair. It was still cool, damp, not warm. It had been used in the morning then. He glanced at the clock key again and imagined the simple movements of someone who, in the same quarter hour, winds a clock, wipes a glass, bends brass tabs open, and carries a small, stiff rectangle between two fingers as if it were the tail of a paper fish. In the hall, a door creaked. A man in his shirt sleeves leaned from the stairs, hair combed flat, eyes careful. He was 30, perhaps a little more, with the face of a boy who had learned to pass for a man by keeping quiet. "Monsieur Collin?" Maigret said. The man nodded. He came down, eyes flicking to the umbrella stand, and then away as if the stand had spoken his name. He shook hands in the wrong order, first with Vernou, who had reappeared, then with Madame Javet, and finally with Maigret, whose hand was heavy and calm. "You work where?" Maigret asked. "At a broker's, Rue Réaumur. I left early today, my head." He touched his temple with an unnecessary care. "I heard the police were here from Madame Boudin below. Is there a problem?" "Only that a photograph is missing," Maigret said. Colin's mouth made a small O that closed at once. "People do not know what to do with a theft that is not a theft." He looked at the mantelpiece without looking, the way you glance at a person in a cafe mirror. "Ah," he said, "that is sad." "You knew the photograph?" "Yes, Madame told me. Her brother." He smiled too lightly. "A handsome man. One sees the jaw in the family." "It rained since dawn," Maigret said. "Your shoes are very dry." "I came down in slippers." "You went out?" "No, I slept late." "The head, as I said." Madame Javet was twisting her hands again. A person anxious for herself watches herself. A person anxious for another watches the other. She watched Colin, but every time she caught herself, she made her eyes return to the frame with the dignity of someone correcting posture. "The concierge," Vernou said from the doorway, "saw no one enter this morning. Last night she went early to bed, her knees." He seemed proud of having obtained the information about the knees. "But there was a woman who asked for Madame Javet yesterday around supper time, in a scarf, the concierge says, dark. She did not give her name. She left after a few minutes, and did not come up." Madame Javet's chin had lifted as Vernou spoke, as if she were bracing against wind. "I had no visitors," she said evenly. Maigret tamped his pipe with a thumb and did not light it. "We will not insist," he said. "Let us say the house is old. People come and go." He stood and put his hat on, a gesture that sometimes made people speak because they felt time leaving them. She did not. The hat stayed on. He looked once more at the frame and then at the umbrella with the rubber band. "May I take that?" he asked, indicating the umbrella. "It isn't mine," she said with a stiff, hopeless dignity. "Precisely." He carried it to the door, feeling its balance. New things had a smell of dust that had not settled yet. In the narrow stair, the concierge's loge breathed cabbage and coal. Madame Boudin, knees wrapped in a shawl, peered through her little window with the distrust that concierges reserve for people who are too polite. "Did you see the umbrella yesterday?" he asked, showing it, not handing it. There are umbrellas. All days, she said. People leave them and come for them later. But that one, perhaps at 9, there was a gentleman with no hat who asked if the rain would stop. I told him I was not God. Did he go up? No. He lit a cigarette under the lintel and then he went to the cafe to wait. I saw him again when I took out the ashes. He had no umbrella then. No hat, no umbrella, rain. People compromised, with the weather in ways that made sense only to them. He thanked her, put the umbrella under his arm and stepped into the street. The cafe across had its windows fogged already, men with damp shoulders leaning over white wine. He crossed slowly, watched by no one. Inside, he ordered a beer and sat with his back to the wall where he could see the house and the concierge's door. He did not plan. He did not need to. The thing itself was ordinary and therefore stubborn. Someone had taken a picture and nothing else. An old war portrait that meant nothing to the world. That was how love and shame behaved. They went for the smallest thing that could not be replaced. He sipped warm beer on a wet morning and let the room's talk settle in layers around him. On the sill, the rain wrote little lines, paused and wrote them again. He thought of Madame Maigret reminding him about the overcoat, about how people hung on to objects because they allowed them to hold a person without speaking their name. He looked at the empty frame in his mind, and then at the umbrella with its rubber band. A man had stood under a lintel at 9, asked a concierge about rain as if asking permission to come and not come. He had gone to wait in a cafe like this one. Perhaps he had watched the house with the same patience Maigret was using now. Across, the Rue du Chemin Vert, the concierge came out to shake her mat and tested the air with her chin, as if measuring the rain's honesty. A woman with a scarf walked past, not the same, not important, just the city leveling itself. Upstairs, behind the heavy curtains, Madame Javet would be moving about with too much quietness, set in the careful rhythm of someone who believes sound can summon the past. In an hour, he would go back. For the moment, he preferred to sit and to let the day draw its own line. People often declared themselves not when they were asked, but when they feared the question would not come again. He looked at the door of the house, at the empty step, and then at the umbrella beside him. It was a trivial object, a shopkeeper's pride purchased by someone who had not wanted to arrive soaked. He ran his finger once around the rubber band, feeling the little resisting tug, and thought, without urgency, that trivial objects often led one to untrivial rooms where people kept drawers shut too long. The beer was half gone. He lit his pipe. Cain did not smoke it, letting the smoke braid itself into the cafe's warmth, and waited for the first person to look twice at the umbrella he had laid in plain sight. The cafe was warm, the sort of warmth that clings to a man's shoulders, even when he leaves. Maigret stayed in his corner, a solid presence among the shuffle of chairs and the dull clink of glasses. He had placed the umbrella against the table leg, deliberately visible, and though no one remarked on it, a few pairs of eyes flickered toward it before looking away. The patrons were men of habit, workers delaying their return to damp courtyards, a clerk with his sandwich and his copy of Le Matin, 2 retired men who argued over the horse races without raising their voices. They noticed everything, even if they pretended not to. He ordered another beer and let it sit untouched for a time, watching the fog gather on the window pane until it blurred the outline of the house across the street. The curtains there had been drawn tighter, or perhaps it was only the gloom of the morning pressing in. He imagined Madame Javet standing near the mantel, staring at the empty frame as if her gaze might fill it again. Some people had eyes that could not stop returning to absence. It was nearly 11 when the door of the cafe opened, and a draught disturbed the stale air. A man came in quickly, as though chased by the drizzle. He was tall, with the kind of hat that had once been respectable, but now sagged under the rain. His coat was too thin for the season, and buttoned all the way to his throat. He ordered a coffee without looking at the others, then turned and scanned the room. His glance brushed the umbrella, just for a moment, and Maigret saw a tightening at the corner of his mouth. Not surprise exactly, more like the recognition of a name overheard. The man sat at the bar. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the small cup, and he warmed them more on the porcelain than on the drink itself. Maigret did not move. He allowed himself the satisfaction of silence, of letting the man believe he was unobserved. People revealed themselves best when they thought the world's eyes were elsewhere. The bartender, a stooped fellow who polished glasses with a rag gone grey from years of service, leaned over and whispered something. The man shook his head quickly, as if to cut off a suggestion, then drank down the rest of his coffee and rose to leave. But his eyes went again to the umbrella, and this time they lingered. Maigret reached for his pipe with unhurried ease, as though stretching a stiff hand. "You forgot something," he said quietly, not raising his voice, yet it carried across the room. The man stopped. He turned halfway, his expression neither denial nor acceptance, merely the tight look of someone caught between two lies and not sure which to choose. "I don't think so," he said, and his voice had that hurried quality of a man who has not spoken in hours and finds himself suddenly forced to. Maigret gestured to the umbrella. "New. A pity to leave it. The rain won't ease today." The man gave a little shrug that was meant to be careless but came out stiff. "Not mine," he said. He buttoned his coat tighter and made for the door. Outside, the rain was heavier now, bouncing from the stones in small silver bursts. Maigret waited a beat, then rose, dropped coins on the table and followed. He did not rush. The man's figure was easy to follow, moving with jerky impatience through the grey street, collar pulled up, hat tilted low. Maigret lit his pipe as he walked, letting the smoke cloud him into ordinariness. The man turned into a narrower street, Rue du Pasteur Wagner, where the houses leaned together as if sharing gossip. At the corner, he paused to light a cigarette, fumbling with wet matches, and glanced back. His eyes brushed Maigret but did not settle. Perhaps he saw only a large man with a pipe, like hundreds in Paris. Perhaps he saw more. He quickened his step. The pursuit, if it could be called one, ended not far away at a modest building with flaking shutters and a green-painted door. The man went inside without hesitation, using a key. Maigret did not follow at once. He stood across the street, under an awning drawing in smoke, watching the door as if it were any other door. Patience was his method, and walls had a way of speaking if you let the silence stretch. After a few minutes, Vernou appeared, a little out of breath, his hat askew from having rushed to keep up. "Who was he?" he asked, almost too eager. "We don't know yet," Maigret said, and his tone made the younger man flush. The inspector shifted on his feet, embarrassed, but Maigret added, "We'll find out. He has a key, so it won't be difficult." They waited together in the drizzle until half an hour later, the green door opened again. This time a woman came out. She wore a scarf pulled tightly under her chin and carried herself with the hurried dignity of someone who fears to be noticed. She turned away from them, heading in the direction of Rue Saint-Maur. Vernou made to step forward, but Maigret held him back with the smallest gesture. "Later," he said. "Too many questions too soon, and people shut their mouths like oysters. Let them believe they have time." The umbrella remained with him, heavy in its newness. It was the sort of object that tied strangers together, the woman in the scarf, the man with the trembling hands, Madame Javet staring at her brother's absent face. It was not the value of the thing, but the chain of touch it represented. By the time they returned to Rue du Chemin Vert, the light had dimmed, though it was still early afternoon. The concierge in her shawl was bent over her coal scuttle, grumbling. She squinted at the umbrella Maigret carried. "You still have that?" "It's useful," he said simply. "Perhaps you'll remember more about the gentleman who left." "I remember he was uneasy. Didn't want to give his name, but he kept watching the door when he stood here. Not mine, the upstairs, as though waiting for someone to open it." Maigret nodded. "Thank you, madame." He climbed the stairs slowly, the boards creaking under his weight. Inside, Madame Javet received him with a composure that seemed forced. Her hands were red from washing, the scent of soap still clinging to them. The mantel had been cleared now, no frame, no brass tabs, nothing but the clock and the paper flowers. She had tried to erase the absence by removing it altogether. "Did you find it?" she asked, though her tone suggested she feared the answer more than she hoped for it. "Not yet." "Tell me, madame, did your brother have many friends?" "He died 25 years ago," she said, almost reproachfully. His friends would be grey men now if they live at all, yet someone wanted his likeness. He let the words sit in the air. A stranger, or someone you know. Her eyes darted to the window, to the rain. I told you I don't know. Maigret studied her in silence, the way one studies the surface of a pond to see if a fish will rise. She resisted, but not well. A small twitch at her jaw betrayed her effort. Finally, she said, There was a woman once. She came some weeks ago. She asked about Henri, my brother. She said she had known him when she was very young, but it was so long ago I thought nothing of it. Did she see the photograph? Yes. And what name did she give? Madame Javet shook her head, her lips pressed tight. She did not say. The silence grew until it filled the room. Outside, a motorcar splashed through a puddle, sending the sound echoing against the walls. Maigret reached for his hat. That will do for now, he said. Thank you, madame. As he stepped back into the street, the drizzle had thinned to a mist. He stood there, umbrella in hand, pipe clamped between his teeth, and let the damp settle into his coat. A photograph gone, a brother dead for a quarter of a century, and yet here were strangers with trembling hands and women in scarves turning keys in unfamiliar doors. It was not theft in the usual sense. It was something older, something carried. Through the years, like a secret folded into a pocket, he began walking slowly toward the Quai des Orfèvres, where reports waited to be written and colleagues would shake their heads at the foolishness of investigating a missing picture. But Maigret felt the shape of the story pressing at him, as insistent as the drizzle on his shoulders. It would not be hurried. The truth was still hidden, but it had begun to stir like something restless behind drawn curtains. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the damp came with him, a fine beading on his coat that steamed slowly in the stale heat of the corridor. A clerk with ink on his fingers glanced up and then down again. People at the police judiciaire knew when to tease and when to hold their tongues. This morning they were uncertain. A missing photograph did not belong to the tidy family of crimes that fit the forms. In his office, the radiator ticked and smelled faintly of dust. On his blotter lay a note from the deputy chief, underlined twice. Report desirable by end of day. Nothing about the rain could hurry. Maigret hung his coat, shook out his hat, and sat with the heaviness that made chairs yield. He wrote the beginning of a report that said as little as possible and then stopped. Reports were for when you knew which way the water ran. Vernou came in with a hesitant knock, hat in hand as if waiting to be scolded. I went back, he said before being asked. The green door in Rue du Pasteur Wagner. The concierge is a man, small with a bad throat. He says the tenant on the second floor rear is named Rouel. Etienne Rouel came 3 months ago with a suitcase and a box tied with string, pays cash, receives few letters. There is a woman who visits. A niece? Maigret asked mildly. The concierge thinks so or says so because it is easier. He has never seen them together in the daylight. Work. A bindery, he thinks. The post left a parcel once, books mended, the ticket said. Rue Oberkampf. Maigret nodded. A bindery would fit the hands that had trembled around a cup, and the way the man's coat seemed worn along the forearms. People who repaired what other people had ruined often carried a tiredness of their own that was not sleep. Good, he said. Leave Rouel for now. Ask the concierge at Rue du Chemin Vert again, about visitors yesterday. Not names, she won't. Have them. Shoes, hats, how they moved. Then go to the cafe opposite and make yourself a nuisance without being noticed. If the bartender is the sort who collects confidences, let him keep yours. I'll be back there later. Vernou looked, relieved to carry instructions away with him, like packets on a tray that could not spill if he held them very level. When he had gone, Maigret sat a while longer, the pipe between his teeth unlit, and thought of the mantel with its pale rectangle, the glass wiped in anxious circles, the brass tabs bent back as carefully as anyone might lift the corner of a sleeping child's blanket. He saw again the rubber band around the new umbrella, the 2 coffee cups with one rim showing a shade of colour Madame Javet would never put on her mouth. Never put on her mouth. He did not ring the prefecture or send a man to fetch papers no one would read. He put on his hat and went out, not to a witness or a suspect, but to lunch. Madame Maigret had kept something warm. He found her in the kitchen with her sleeves rolled, the window fogged by steam and rain conspiring together. She did not ask him about his mourning. It was one of the freedoms of their marriage that she let silence stand until it chose to sit. She set a dish of endives under his nose, there was ham in among them, and watched to see if he would notice the seasoning. He did and said so. They spoke of Sunday and Mo, of whether her sister's hens would lay well in such weather, of a neighbour's daughter who had put up new curtains too bright for the stair. He ate slowly, and after a time he mentioned, as if it had just occurred to him, that a woman had had a picture taken from its frame. "What for?" she asked, half listening, as she dried a pot. "That is what we're to find out," he said. "The frame stayed. People take pictures out all the time when they clean," she said, with the authority of someone who had cleaned places he had never seen. "They say, 'I will polish the glass properly, not just round the corners,' and then they lay it down and forget until the water boils dry. And the photograph? They put it back crooked." She smiled a little at his expression. "Or they put behind it some silliness. You know, locks of hair, the first cinema ticket, a medal one didn't earn. My aunt kept a letter behind Grandpère's portrait for 20 years, and then one day she thought the mice had eaten it, but it was only that the glue had let go and it slid to the bottom. We found it when we moved." He wiped his mouth and sat back, heavy with food, and the small domestic clarity that was often more use than any magnifying glass. "A letter," he repeated. "A little one," she said, her mind on her dishcloth. "Paper keeps better in a frame than in a drawer." He thanked her with a look and did not explain for once. In the hall, he lifted his coat and felt in the pocket for the umbrella's handle. On the landing, the neighbours' smells greeted him, the ghost of soup, a whiff of shoe polish. Back outside, the rain had thinned to a net, fine enough to let sound through. At Rue du Chemin Vert, the concierge looked as if she had been sitting all her life in that chair behind the little window with its crocheted curtain. She pursed her mouth when she saw him, not unfriendly, simply prepared for questions to prove more work than they were worth. "You remember," he said, "the woman in a scarf who asked yesterday around supper?" "She did not go up," the concierge said, immediately pleased to correct him before he could accuse her of not having seen what she had not seen. "She asked, and when I said Madame Javet did not receive, she left. The gentleman at 9, he smoked in the doorway. People always smoke where they shouldn't. It stinks up the stair." "And some weeks ago," he asked, "another woman, perhaps younger, who asked about a brother's name." The concierge's face arranged itself into drawers opening and closing. "Ah, there was one before, yes. With a little suitcase." "No, not a suitcase, a hat box." She had a way of standing, on one foot, then the other, as if she were on a station platform. "I told her to come back in the afternoon and she did not." "Did she leave anything?" "A message, an envelope. I slipped it under Madame Javet's door, as I do when there is no answer. Madame Javet returned it later. She said the person, though had the wrong address." He looked up the stair. "People returned envelopes for 2 reasons, pride or fear." "Thank you," he said, and meant it. He was generous with thank yous to people who had to sit all day watching other people go in and out. Madame Javet opened at his ring with the stiffness of someone who would like to open her mouth first, and did not trust what would come out. The mantelpiece was too bare. Finding a room rearranged in the middle of a day always had the quality of walking into an argument after the worst words had been spoken. "May I see the frame, madame?" he asked, as if asking to borrow salt. "Why?" It came out too quick. Then she pressed her lips. "I put it away." "Where one puts things to stop seeing them," he said mildly. "A drawer that sticks in cold weather, a trunk with a scar along the lid." She wavered. It was not authority that won with her, but weight, the sense that his request would not go away if she delayed it. At last she crossed to a buffet and drew from it the frame wrapped in a towel. She did not meet his eyes. He laid it on the table and opened the little brass tongues very carefully, one by one, like a man loosening a patient's bandage. Behind the glass, the cardboard backing lay with its pale ghost on one side, and on the other, a rough, fibrous face with the faint stamp of the photographer, letters eaten by time. Atelier B, Mont Boulevard Vol. He slid a nail under the edge and lifted. Something whispered, almost nothing, the sound of paper that had once stuck and remembered it. At one corner, a darker triangle showed where a second sheet had been, its outline like a continent on an old map. A hair-thin scrap clung to the wood. Torn along a fold, he coaxed it free. The glue had let go recently. The smell, so slight most noses would miss it, was of gum warmed by hands. He did not read it. There was nothing to read. Only the shallow trace of ink where a stroke had bled, a loop that might have been a G or merely the end of a flourish. On the backing, a pinhole that had no reason to be there unless someone had pressed too hard with the point of a hairpin or a pin to pry something up. The glass bore those small circular swirls again, the sort people make when they polish in a hurry. "It is possible," he said, not looking at her, "that there was once behind the photograph a letter. People sometimes keep things they cannot put in a drawer. Someone who knew it was there might want it now and not the picture." "I know nothing about any letter," she said, too quickly again. He wrapped the frame back in the towel and slid the scrap into his wallet as if it were a receipt for a bill paid too long ago. "You returned an envelope to the concierge some weeks ago," he said, his voice gentler than his words, "from a woman with a hat box. She had the wrong address. And you wrote that on the envelope? Or did you open it and see it was the wrong letter?" Her face shut itself with a dignity that was more honest than any denial. "I am not a thief," she said. "Nor am I," he said. "I am a man who looks at tables where coffee has left a ring and thinks about anyone who sat on the other chair. Your brother was called Henri. He died young. People who die young do not always stop living." She sank a little into a chair, as if her bones had been told it was safe to sit. "There was a girl once," she said to the floor. "It was before the war ended. She came to say he had promised things young men promise. She was so slight I could have put my hands around her wrists. Our mother turned her away. We were not unkind," she added quickly, and after a second, "Not very." "What was her name?" "Something with a J. I do not remember," she said, and the shame of not remembering a name was worse than any other. He put on his hat. "I will bring your photograph back when I can," he said, and it sounded like a promise about more than a rectangle of paper. She did not answer. Outside, the gutter had begun to talk, a thin voice. He walked the short way to Rue Oberkampf and stood under the awning of a shop that sold fishing tackle out of season. He lit his pipe and considered the bindery, the woman with the scarf, the rubber band on the umbrella, the scrap that still smelled of glue if one put it to the nose and breathed like a child, making sure a plant was alive. If a letter had been kept behind a young man's face for 20 years and then taken last night, it meant that someone had thought time would do what guilt had failed to. But time kept its own counsel. He did not visit the bindery. He left Ruelle, his day. Instead, he went back to the cafe and took the same seat. Vernou was there already, practicing the art of not looking out of place. The bartender leaned on his counter and after a moment came over with a glass without having been asked. "The gentleman with the thin coat," he said, as if continuing a conversation that had begun in another century, "was here last night. Sat where you are, Chief. Watched the house as if counting its bricks. When the lady with the scarf came from the green door across, he stood so fast he left a coin on the table. Not his habit. He followed her a little and then came back. He has hands like paper." "Did he speak to anyone?" "To no one," the bartender said. "But he asked me once if I knew whether the rain would stop, as if I worked for the prefecture of weather." He smiled with the thin pride of a man who thinks his joke's good enough for himself. Maigret let the glass sit. Through the window he could see the umbrella. He had leaned again against the table leg, obedient, present. Objects did not lie. They waited. In the slow curve of the afternoon, he planned nothing. He would go to Boulevard Voltaire and see if any photo atelier answered to a name that could be Beaumont. He would ask at the bindery later, find out how men who mend books learn where secrets are kept. But for now he preferred the company of his pipe and the small talk of a room where men warmed themselves because the city never would. He set the scrap once more to his nose and, catching again that faint gum scent, understood enough to be patient. Somewhere very near, a person was trying to make the past behave. The rain, unhurried, continued to write its fine script on the panes. The afternoon folded into itself in that slow Paris way, where the light seems to change only because the rain grows finer. Maigret drained nothing from his glass, set the pipe in his pocket, and rose with the kind of deliberation that turns a walk into a decision. Boulevard Voltaire lay 2 tram stops away under a sky the color of wet paper. Shop fronts blinked with weak electricity. The letters on old signs had learned to live with their missing strokes. He found the place by not looking for it too hard. Photographie d'Art Beaumont still clung to the facade above a draper's that had annexed half the window with ribbons and a headless mannequin. Behind the glass, next door, the old studio remained, its curtains faded the brown of tea, left overnight. When he pushed at the bell, a slow chime sounded, as if it had to find its breath. A woman came from the back, wiping her hands on a cloth she had used for too many years to improve anything. "We are open," she said without conviction. "For passport pictures mainly. Weddings when there are weddings." He showed the scrap. From his wallet, without taking it fully out, a courteous exposure. "Your stamp," he said, "or your father's." She looked at it with her head tipped, the way seamstresses do when judging a hem. "Long before me," she said. "My uncle's time." He took the soldiers. "The last year of the war they stood where you stand for their mothers. He kept ledgers because the prefecture made him. What about it?" "There was a portrait of a young man in uniform," Maigret said. "The cardboard carried your mark. Someone took it from its frame last night." "Then they loved him," she said simply, and reached under the counter for a book grown fat with damp and dust. She opened it, not to any page in particular. The habit of finding things that don't want to be found had made her fingers clever. The paper whispered, names, addresses, the tilt of hands that had written quickly when people were waiting. "We used Beaumont then with the U. Some clerk said it looked finer." He gave her the name and watched it travel through her mind. "Javet, Henri." She placed one finger on the margin and ran it down as if measuring a child. After a time, she stopped. "Here, 7 December. Cabinet size, 1 for the house, 2 carts for sending. Paid. Address Rue du Chemin Vert." She added nothing, but her finger made a small inward curve and caught on a note where the ink had paled. There, reprint ordered, 3rd of February, by Mademoiselle J.L. The rest is smudged. The street, Rue des Immeubles Industriels. A number, but the ink went away years ago. She smiled with a tired pride. "We used poor inks in the shortages." "Did anyone ask recently for the negative?" he said. "The negatives," she grimaced, "were broken in the flood of 29, the cellar. People come now and then, with the look you see in winter windows. Last month a woman asked for a young man in a horizon blue coat. She wore a scarf, not for elegance. She left as she came, as if the floor might give way if she stayed. She did not give her name." "She came alone?" "People who ask for ghosts come alone," she said, and put the book away as if returning a hand to a sleeve. "If you find her, tell her we keep nothing we do not mean to, and that forgetting is not an art, but an accident." He thanked her, and it was not a courtesy. He had the old address now with its name like a row of factory windows. Outside on the boulevard, a tram slithered past with its bell half-hearted, and a man on a bicycle rode with his hat tied under his chin like a boy. Maigret turned toward Rue Oberkampf, following a thought he did not push, the way one lets a dog choose the hedgerow. He found the bindery by smell before he saw its door, the cleanly sour paste, the leather, the sweet trace of gum that had been under his nose all morning. Inside, the air was warm with a kind of care he respected. Books lay in patient lines, their spines removed, their threads like ribs. A pot of glue sat in a pan of water to keep it soft. The man at the table had a hump to his shoulders that came from bending over other people's delays. He looked up, with eyes that had learned not to hope for anything from strangers. "I'm not here to complain," Maigret said, "because binders expect complaints about time. I'm looking for a man who sometimes works in such places. Ruel. Etienne." The binder rubbed his thumb and forefinger together in a little circle, a gesture that in his world meant paste. "He was here," he said. "He works clean. He's quiet, pays attention when you tell him why cloth needs patience. He knows how to lift something that was never meant to be lifted. A good quality in work and a bad one in life, perhaps. Where did he go when he left? Maigret asked, without emphasis. Home, I suppose. Or to the woman who visits him. When the glue sets. A tall woman, the kind who keeps her scarf neat even when it rains. She brings him packets sometimes, old papers tied with string, photographs. He fixes them to board with wheat paste, the way one would fix a saint's picture, in a cheap frame. They talk little. The look between them is not new. Hat boxes? Maigret said. The binder blinked. Once. The cardboard kind with the wire handle. You carry that from a closet where someone has hidden it too long. He looked at his pot, and turned the flame lower with exactness. Monsieur Ruel is not a thief. He is the sort who believes his hands make him forgiven. Maigret left him with that sentence, and the smell of gum that was almost the same as on the scrap in his wallet. And not exactly the same. Men had recipes for their glues as women did for soup. On Rue du Pasteur Wagner, the green-painted door had gone a darker shade with the wet. The concierge with the bad throat came out to empty a pan of ash into the alley and coughed as though arguing with his own pipes. You have a tenant named Ruel, Maigret said mildly. The man nodded with the resignation of someone whose knowledge had begun to interest other people. Second floor rear. He keeps odd hours, not out of wickedness but habit. I hear his kettle, then nothing. A woman goes up sometimes. She does not leave her scent in the stair like some do. Scarf, Maigret said. That one, the concierge said, not surprised. And the gentleman who came to ask if the rain would stop the other night. A different sort of quiet, the concierge said. He stood as if counting breaths. When the woman left, he went after her and came back with his face arranged wrong. He dropped a coin at the cafe. People who drop coins are either in love or in trouble with mathematics. The courtyard beyond smelled of damp stone, and a cat somewhere who had learned to hate the weather. Maigret climbed unhurried, the boards talking under his weight. He did not knock. He listened. A kettle somewhere, not here. The sound of paper, being turned with care. He knocked then, the way he always did. 3 soft acknowledgements rather than a demand. Ruel opened. His thin coat had been traded for a sweater with a hole he had tried to pretend was not there by smoothing the wool. His face carried the fixed politeness of someone who has been poor long enough to fear refusing anyone a seat. You left an umbrella across from Rue du Chemin Vert, Maigret said, holding it out. Concierge said you had no hat. New umbrellas stand out the way new shoes do. I do not want trouble, Ruel said, and the sentence came like a key that had been turned too often in a bad lock. I mend books. That is why I came to you, Maigret said. He did not sit. The room was clean with a woman's cleanliness that tries to cover more than dust. On the table lay a spool of linen thread, a bone folder, a small brush still, tacky at the tip. Near the window a hat box sat like an extra person who did not intend to speak. He looked at it without looking. A photograph is missing from a frame in Rue du Chemin Vert. It may be that behind it there was once a letter. Ruel's eyes went to the window glass, where the rain wrote numbers that meant nothing. People keep letters, he said finally. They think paper is stronger than memory. And is. It, for a while, Ruel said. His hands rested flat on the table, palms down like a schoolboy's. The fingers were clean, but the nails had paste half-moons. If you think I took anything that is not mine, you should search. He moved as if to push the hat box with his foot farther beneath the chair and stopped in the middle of the gesture, ashamed of its transparency. I fix things, he said again, quieter. It is a profession for the guilty. Who asked you to fix this one? Maigret did not raise his eyes. He watched Ruel choose a word and then find it too large. A friend, the man said. Someone who wanted to make tidy what had been left untidy by time. I told her I would not take something people could accuse me of. She said, accusation. Was late to the story. He glanced up, misery tightening his mouth. I am not paid well, but I am not paid for crimes. Did the friend wear a scarf? She wears dignity, he said, and turned his head away as if the sentence had cost him a tooth. The kettle in the neighbour's room boiled over just then, a furious little hiss that saved them both from saying more. Maigret let the silence come back, heavier. He took the umbrella from under his arm and set it neatly by the door, as though it had come home and found its corner. "If she comes," he said, "tell her that the studio on Boulevard Voltaire keeps better ledgers than we keep secrets. Tell her that if she wants the past to be orderly, she must let living people speak. And tell her that I will be at the café after 5. It is easier to explain things in the presence of ordinary noise." He left without asking to look into the hat box. On the stair, a woman arriving had to step aside for him. She was not the scarf woman. She had a child and a bag of onions and the tired courage of women who take care of 2 rooms and a husband with a cough. In the street, the light had turned the color of pewter. He walked back to Rue du Chemin Vert because moving between the same places allows people to catch you in their schedules. The bartender looked up with a politeness that had learned his trade from weather vanes. Vernou at a table had turned his collar and his notebook to the same degree. A man in a sweater came to the door of the greenhouse and spoke to a woman. "With a scarf," the bartender said without being asked. Pride warm in his eyes at having something to sell that wasn't wine. He gave her nothing. She gave him the kind of look that used to be for saints. Then she crossed to the baker and stood there as if bread might speak to her. Maigret sat and put his hat on the chair beside him. He did not look out the window. He watched the room as one watches water when waiting for a fish. After a while the door opened, and the draught made the lamp glass tremble. The woman with the scarf came in, looking first at no one, and then at him, as if he were a coat rack. She could lean on without shame. She had a face that had once been too serious for her age, and had now grown into it. She untied the scarf but did not remove it. Her hands were bare and chapped, ringless. "You said 5, she murmured, as if continuing a letter. "I am Jeanne." The Cour J in the studio ledger fitted itself into her voice, as a key finds the last ward. He did not ask for her other name. People keep one name to themselves when they come to tell the truth, and it helps them to manage if you leave it in their pocket. He moved his glass enough that she could sit opposite without feeling looked at. The bartender, who had his kindnesses, put a little glass of white by her elbow and went away. "I did not want the picture," she said, eyes on the table grain. "I wanted what was behind it. I did not think anyone would notice. Only a frame." A little disturbed, "We told ourselves there would be no harm to the living. And what of harm to the dead?" he asked mildly. "The dead cannot be harmed," she said, and the sentence shook a very little, like a string pulled tight. "Only the living who love them can be." He nodded. People practiced their words alone and found them less strong, in a room with chairs and other people breathing. "There was a letter," he said, "long ago." "There was a letter," she repeated, and the way she said it made the rain seem louder for a second, as if the city had leaned in. She took up the glass and did not drink. "He wrote to say a thing that would have made my life different. He wrote on a day he could not post it, and someone put it behind his face to keep his promise from spoiling before he could come back to it. He did not come back. I did not ask for the letter for years. One misses the right moment, and then one invents reasons. At last a reason arrived I could not ignore." She looked up then, and he saw the tiredness that is not sleep, but the wearing smooth of hope over too many years. "We took the letter," she said without drama, as one admits, "to buying bread. Not because we wanted to steal, but because it was ours, and because the person who kept it would not give it. We meant to put the picture back when our hands had stopped shaking. That is the whole of it." He did not answer. He let her sit with what she had said until it became something she could bear. In the corner, Vernou pretended indifference with the thick ineptness of a man not yet trained by boredom. Outside, a bus sighed and moved on. When at last she raised her eyes again, she added very quietly, "There is a girl." "Of course," he said. The beer was warm. It had not suffered from being ignored. "A woman," Jeanne corrected herself, and the correction had pride in it. "She is the age I was when I stood at that concierge's little window and asked for permission to exist. She needed the letter. I needed it so that I could stop being a person who knocks and goes away. You will bring it," he said. "You will bring it without folding it more than time has folded it already. And you will not keep the picture." She shook her head. "I do not want the picture. I have had the face all my life. It is the words I lacked. Give me 1 night. 1 night, he agreed. Not because he had to bargain, but because people like to be granted what they have allowed themselves at last to ask for. He stood then, and she stood too, and in the simple moving of chairs, the room recovered its ordinary noise. He did not watch her put on her scarf. He watched instead the umbrella by his chair and thought, with the blunt tenderness he reserved for other people's stubborn decencies, that ordinary things sometimes held the place of absolution. When he stepped back into the wet street. The sky had gone from pewter to the color of cooling ash. He walked to the corner without hurry, turned his collar up and thought of the atelier's ledger, the careful hand that had written a name and a street that had outlived the ink. Tomorrow he would go to Rue des Immeubles Industriels and see the building that had contained that name and that waiting. For tonight, it was enough to let the city grow quiet around him, while a woman and a man with paste under his nails decided how to make the past behave without tearing it. The rain, which never promised anything, kept its promise. The following morning broke with a sky the color of unwashed linen, the rain reduced to a fine mist that blurred the outlines of chimneys along the Seine. Maigret left his apartment earlier than usual, his heavy coat buttoned to the throat, pipe already clenched but unlit. Madame Maigret had pressed him to eat more than bread, but he had demurred with a muttered promise of coffee later. He had woken with the sense of something unfinished. Pressing at him, a story paused at its midpoint. Jean's face in the café the previous evening, tired, resolute, as if she had finally touched something long denied, remained with him. He walked, preferring the measured rhythm of his feet to the jolting tram. Rue des Immeubles Industriels, stretched like a corridor from another century, lined with tall, narrow buildings whose windows were streaked with soot and time. At number 17, a façade leaned a little forward, its shutters flaking pale green paint. The concierge's lodge was dim, smelling of damp wool and onions, and behind the glass sat a man who resembled a sack tied loosely at the middle. He peered at Maigret without curiosity until the inspector showed his card. "You've had tenants here a long time?" Maigret asked. "Too long," the concierge rasped. "People leave, but their dust stays. You're asking about the Javet girl?" The name had come unprompted, and Maigret let the silence hang just long enough for the man to feel clever. "She lived here," the concierge went on, "with her mother, years ago. Before the war and after, until the mother died. Then she left with nothing but a case tied with twine, never married, the kind who looks both ways before speaking." "She was visited often?" The concierge lifted his shoulders. "By one young man, a soldier. He wore the horizon blue. Brought flowers once, I think. I was younger then. I didn't watch as much as I do now. He stopped coming. They all stopped after the war. She kept to herself. I'd see her sometimes walking with letters she never posted. A letter. The shape of the story grew clearer. Maigret thanked him and climbed to the second floor, where the air grew stale with neglect. Dust filmed the banister, and doors closed themselves with the reluctance of wood swollen by years. At a landing he paused, not because there was anything to see, but because he felt the ghost of quiet lives pressing close, as if walls remembered more than they revealed. Back on the street, he lit his pipe at last. The taste was bitter from damp, but it steadied his thoughts. The photograph had once belonged to more than memory. Behind it had been a letter, written in the pause between departure and death. Jeanne had said she needed it not for herself, but for a girl, a woman now, a daughter perhaps. That thought carried the weight of inevitability. A promise once written, a child once denied, a life that had grown in silence. He returned toward Rue du Chemin Vert, where Madame Javet lived. Behind her curtains, on the way he stopped again at the café opposite, the familiar warmth enveloping him. Vernou was already there, stiff-backed, his notebook open but mostly blank. The young inspector looked eager, as though waiting to be given a problem he could solve with ink alone. "She came again," Vernou reported, lowering his voice. "The woman with the scarf, Jeanne. She went up the green door, stayed perhaps 10 minutes, then left. Ruel followed her as far as the corner and turned back. He looks at her as if he owes her something." Maigret grunted softly, neither approving nor dismissing. He ordered coffee and sat watching the street through the fogged glass. Across the way, the concierge at Madame Javet's house was sweeping water from the step with the futility of a man who has spent his life fighting rain. When Maigret crossed and rang, Madame Javet opened with a composure too stiff to be natural. Her eyes darted once to the mantel, which was still bare. She asked whether he had news, and he said only that he wished to speak. They sat in the parlor, where the clock ticked with uneven heartbeats. "Madam," Maigret said slowly, "there was a letter once behind your brother's photograph. You knew it. You chose to keep it." Her lips parted, then pressed together again. She folded her hands on her lap, but the fingers would not stay still. "It was my brother's, his handwriting. He belonged to us." "He belonged also to someone else," Maigret said gently. "A girl who came here once many years ago. She was turned away. The letter was for her." Madame Javet's eyes flickered with something between anger and shame. "It was foolishness. Boys at the front wrote anything. She had no right to claim him. He wrote of a promise, perhaps more than one, and she had a child. That child is now grown. They came for what was theirs, not to rob you." Her silence thickened, but her shoulders sagged. When she finally spoke, it was in a voice not meant to travel far. "I thought if it stayed here with me, he would remain mine. The picture was not enough. I could not let her have the words too." Maigret did not argue. People explained themselves more fully to their own guilt than to anyone else. He rose slowly, and she did not stop him. In the hall, he felt the damp towel still hanging on the chair rail, forgotten after its hurried use. Back in the cafe, he sat again, nodding briefly to Vernou, who fidgeted with his pencil. The day lengthened toward evening. The umbrella leaned as always against the chair, patient as a sentinel. And then, just as the lamps outside flickered on and the first cars hissed along the wet street, Jeanne returned. She entered with quiet determination, the scarf pulled tight against her cheeks. She sat opposite him without waiting to be invited, her hands clutching a small envelope worn at the edges, its flap resealed with care. She set it on the table between them. "It is his letter," she said simply. "We have read it. We will not keep it from you." Maigret looked at the envelope, but did not touch it. The writing on the front was faint, smudged by years of being pressed against another surface. The curves of the letters spoke of haste and youth, of a hand writing before courage failed. "He promised marriage," Jeanne said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "He promised to acknowledge the child if she came. But he never returned. The letter was hidden so that no one could hold him to it. We needed it now, not for the law, but for the girl. She is mine, but she is also his. She deserves to know her name." Maigret nodded once. It was not a confession in the sense of crime. It was an explanation that made the theft small and the silence large. He folded his hands, pipe resting between them, and regarded her with that patience which often gave people more than they asked for. "You will return the photograph to Madame Javet," he said at last. "It belongs where it was. The letter, perhaps you will make a copy so both can keep what they need. That is for you to decide. The police are not guardians of love." Jeanne's eyes filled suddenly, but she did not let the tears fall. She rose, and when she left, the envelope still lay on the table. Maigret did not reach for it. He finished his coffee, cold now, and watched the door swing shut behind her. The case, if it could be called that, was nearly over. There would be no headlines, no report that mattered. Yet the story had played itself out in his mind until it was whole. A letter hidden behind a young man's face, kept too long by one woman, claimed at last by another, and a daughter standing unseen at the end of it all. When he stepped outside, the mist had turned once more to rain, steady, unhurried, washing the streets clean without ever finishing. He walked slowly toward the river, the umbrella under his arm, pipe warm in his mouth. His thoughts were not on arrests or reports, but on how the smallest things, an empty frame, a scrap of glue, a woman's scarf, could carry the weight of lives deferred and promises silenced. The city exhaled around him, and he let it. Some truths did not need proclamations. They needed only to be acknowledged in the quiet of a rainy evening, and then carried with patience, like a pipe that burns low and steady until the bowl is empty. Evening fell not so much as a change of light, but as the city deciding to grow quieter. At home the lobby smelled of damp wool, and upstairs Madame Maigret had kept the pot on the back of the stove, where things never quite boil and never quite cool. He washed his hands slowly, as if the day were something one could rinse away, and sat at the small kitchen table, while she put out bread and a dish of potatoes browned with lardons that had given up their salt to everything around them. He did not tell her the story in a line. He never did. It came out in pieces between mouthfuls and pauses, the way steam escapes a lid. He spoke of the studio on Boulevard Voltaire, of the ledger with its careful hand, of a woman with a scarf who had needed words that had been hidden behind a young man's face. He did not show her the envelope at first. It lay in his coat pocket like a small animal that had chosen to sleep in his care. When he set it finally on the table, she did not reach for it. She looked at it the way women look at a bundle of letters they have tied themselves with string they could untie in the dark. You said to her she might make a copy, she said, wiping a plate with a square of linen, so clean it shone. That was right. She left the letter, he said, perhaps because she feared if she took it she would never give it back. Madame Maigret snuffed the little gas flame with her breath and sat opposite him, hands folded, not touching his, which was their way of tenderness. Give them both one, she said simply, the original to the girl and a copy to the sister, or the other way. It matters less than that each has something she can carry without shame. The bindery, he said, thinking aloud. Paste. Thin paper, a backing that will not eat the ink. Ruel has hands for that. Men who mend things, she said, are always kinder than they know. He slept badly, not for worry, but because the rain changed its rhythm against the window in the early hours, tapping in a way that called up old steps on old stairs. In the morning he rose earlier than the city and brewed coffee strong enough to find a man's bones. He put the envelope in his inside pocket, under the wool where it would be warm, and walked out into air that felt wrung from cloth. At the quay, Des Orfèvres, the corridor smelled of carbide lamps and the faint metallic odor of typewriter ribbon. In his office, the deputy chief's note had grown a second underline. Report? Someone had scrawled, with the optimism of clerks who believe the world can be made sensible by noon if one begins with the proper form. He sat, lit his pipe, and began a report that said what it had to, and nothing that would bruise anyone. Recovery. Of missing photograph effected, he wrote, though it was not yet true, domestic matter no prosecution recommended. He paused, then added a sentence about papers of personal nature, a phrase that would please no one and offend no one. Inspector Longnon came to the door like a rain cloud that had found itself indoors. He stood with his hat in his hands as if it had misbehaved. So, he said gloomily, you have fetched back a picture from a frame. Next, we shall be called to settle quarrels about teaspoons. Maigret blew smoke without heat. If the teaspoon was put in the wrong mouth 20 years ago, he said, there is work in it. Longnon made a face that might have been agreement in a different century, and withdrew, leaving behind him the small draft men bring who never fully come in. He carried the letter to Rue Oberkampf, where the bindery already smelled awake. Ruel looked up from his bench, his sweater mended with a thread that did not quite match. His eyes went to the bulge in Maigret's pocket before the envelope showed. Men who mend things see shapes and weights. You have it, Ruel said, reverent without being theatrical. For one day, Maigret said, she needs the words. The sister needs the face. Between them, they must stop hiding from one another. Ruel washed his hands at the little sink as if before touching blessed bread. He dried them carefully, then laid a square of clean paper. On the table as a surgeon lays a sheet. Maigret set the envelope down. The flap had been sealed and opened again, sealed again with a care that had felt like a kind of apology. Ruel warmed a knife's back over a candle and slid it under the gum, not to hurt what had once stuck. He lifted the single sheet, 2 pages, written front and back, the ink gone brown where once it had been violet. The letters had the haste of a man who wrote with a train in his ear. Ruel did not read. Men like him did not need words to respect them. He laid the sheet between 2 thinner leaves of Japanese paper, whispered as much as paper can whisper, and smoothed it with the bone folder until the air slid away. "We will mount it to a support that does not take," he said, "so that neither of them loses what is theirs." He looked up, oddly pleading. "You will not require that it be brought to a station and left in a drawer?" "I require nothing," Maigret said, and it was true. "Make a copy for the sister. A photograph. Perhaps the studio on Voltaire would do it better, but the ink is low and the paper thin." "I can photograph without light," Ruel said, with the small pride of craftsmen, and went to the back where a camera slept under a cloth like a bird with its head beneath its wing. Maigret left him and went on to Rue du Chemin Vert. The concierge raised her chin like a hen smelling grain when she saw him. "She has been to the baker," the woman informed him, with a neutrality that wished to be an opinion. "Bought a brioche as if there were a christening." "Perhaps there is," he said and climbed. Madame Javet opened. She had put on a better blouse that did not suit her. It belonged to the Sundays when she still visited cousins. The mantle was still empty, as if she had punished the frame for its betrayal. When she saw he had not come to accuse, her face loosened by a degree only a practiced eye would see. "I will bring your photograph," he said, "this afternoon. The letter will be returned to those it was written for. If you wish, you may keep a copy. Paper is cheaper than anger." She stood with her hands flat on the table as if to stop it lifting. "I kept it because our mother told me to. She said promises made at the front belong to the front. She said girls with hat boxes always want too much." "And what did you want?" he asked, not unkindly. "To be the person who was waited for," she said, and hearing the sentence seem true surprised her into a small, ugly laugh that was not at anyone but at time itself. "When they came last night, the two of them, first the older one, then the younger, I made them coffee so they would sit like guests and not like accusers. I thought if I served them, it would mean I chose the situation." "You served 2 cups," he said. "The lipstick was not yours." She touched her mouth with a certain pride. "No," she said, "I am not a woman of colors." He left her then in the small dignity of having admitted a thing aloud, and went back to the café where the day had its headquarters. Vernou had spread his notebook like a picnic and was pretending to be invisible by being too still. Maigret let him be. The bartender brought coffee without asking and tilted his head toward the door in the minute language of men who like to share news. There was none yet. It was around 3 when Jean came with the younger woman. She did not push her forward or introduce her. She sat, and the girl stood, as girls do, who are not sure of the chair's allegiance. She had the face one expects when told you look like him, though she had heard it too many times to take it as a favor. She had put color on her mouth, a brave, cheap red that did not quite reach to courage. "This is Claire," Jean said simply, and the name made a small shift in the room as names do when they fit. Claire looked at Maigret with the guardedness of those who have learned that men in hats might be either saviors or delays. He nodded to her just once, as one nods to someone in a waiting room to say, "We are all in the same weather." "Your letter," he said, and it was not his to give, but he was the one who would place it on the right table. They all went together to Rue Oberkampf, where Ruel had done what hands can do. He had mounted the letter between thin papers so that it floated without sticking, and he had made a photograph on paper so smooth it reflected a man's doubt. The original, tender as a leaf, lay in a folder that smelled faintly of starch. The copy lay beneath it, dumb and sufficient. Jeanne did not take the original. She stepped aside and let Claire take it. The girl's hands shook, but she held it. The way one holds a newborn, with the tenderness that is fear and gratitude at once. She did not read. She pressed it once lightly to her mouth and then, as if ashamed, to her cheek. Ruel looked away, embarrassed by his own eyes. "Will you come with us to give the copy to Madame Javet?" Jeanne asked Maigret in the voice of someone who knows she has a right and still asks permission. He walked with them the short distance back. In the parlor, the clock seemed to look at them. Madame Javet stood, not in defense, but in stubbornness. Jeanne placed the photograph on the table, not as a gift, not as a surrender, but as something that had found its level. "You may keep him," she said very quietly. "We have the words." For a second there was nothing. Then something gave way in the room where things had been held too tightly for too long. It was not tears at first, it was the drop of the shoulders, the sitting down without knowing one sat, the hand that went to the breast as if to close a button that had never been there. The sound that followed was small and helpless, and not young. The sound of a woman who has discovered that keeping does not prevent losing. Claire, who had planned nothing for this moment, did the one simple thing. She walked to the mantel and, with an awkward care, set the frame back in its place. It stood there open-mouthed a second, until she straightened the brass tongues with a thumb, the way one tends to a child's collar. She stepped back. The pale rectangle had a border again. No one said thank you. It would have been indecent. They stood in a quiet that was not quite peace and not quite truce, but something between. Maigret looked at the clock and thought of Sunday in Meaux, of overcoats brushed, of people who grow old with their decencies. He thought of the deputy chief's underlines, and of Lognon's teaspoon, and of how, sometimes, the weight of the city is in a single room where women are careful with cups. He left them there because staying would have made him a witness to a family, and he was only a man who had brought an object from one address to another. On the step, the concierge pretended to be surprised to see him, though she had been listening with the particular silence of concierge since the bell rang. "Well," she said, with the appetite of those who like to know what is knowable. "It will rain again," he said, and tipped his hat. Back across at the café, he took his chair and let the umbrella rest once more against the leg. The bartender polished a glass with a rag that would never be clean, and after a time set a beer beside the pipe that had gone out. Through the fogged window he watched the house where, upstairs, a frame no longer held only absence. He did not feel clever. He felt the worth of waiting. When Vernou finally allowed himself to ask, "Shall I write it up as recovery of stolen property?" Maigret shook his head. "Write it up as weather," he said mildly. "Put that it rained and that people came in out of it, and one or two of them were finally less wet." The next morning, Paris woke with a raw wind that pushed the clouds too quickly across the sky, tearing at them like impatient hands. The rain had paused, but the streets glistened as though they had been freshly washed, every stone rinsed of secrets, only to be ready to take on more. Maigret walked slowly down the quay, his hat pulled low, his pipe cold in his pocket. The case, if such a word belonged here, had found its natural resting place. The photograph back in its frame, the letter held by the girl who had needed it, and silence restored in the Javet household. Yet something in him resisted closing the door too neatly. At the office, the report he had drafted lay where he had left it, the ink dry, the sentences heavy with deliberate vagueness. Vernou arrived not long after, carrying the stiffness of a man who expected to be judged. He put his notebook down without opening it and waited. Maigret poured himself coffee from the carafe that tasted faintly of metal and watched the younger man over the rim. "You've written your version?" Maigret asked. "Yes, Chief. Theft reported. Personal matter. Resolved without charges. Recovery of property. No further action." He spoke quickly, as if eager to have the words out of his mouth before they went stale. Maigret nodded. "You've learned to use the right phrases. They are useful for filing cabinets, less useful for people." Vernou flushed, but he held his ground. "What should I have written?" "That it rained," Maigret said quietly. "That a woman held on to her brother's promises too long. That another woman carried a scarf and waited half her life to collect what she was owed. That a girl came to know her father's name in silence. None of it belongs on a form, but all of it is the truth." The young inspector lowered his eyes, and for a moment the sound of typewriters in nearby rooms filled the air. Maigret let the silence do its work before he dismissed him with a wave of the hand. The boy would learn, or he would not. Some things could not be taught by ink. Toward midday, Maigret stepped out again, his feet carrying him back toward Rue du Chemin Vert, as if by their own accord. He told himself he wanted only to be certain the frame was in its place, that Madame Javet had, not in some fit of shame, removed it again, but he knew it was more than that. He wanted to see how silence settled after words had been spoken. The concierge met him with a look that pretended indifference, though her eyes searched him for scraps of news. He gave her none. Upstairs, Madame Javet opened the door without surprise. The parlour smelled faintly of polish. She had cleaned as women do when trying to impose order on things beyond their grasp. On the mantel, the frame stood once more, the photograph inside, straight and solemn. The young man in uniform looked out with that expression soldiers wore when the camera had asked them to appear older than they were. She caught him studying it. "It is better this way," she said, not quite convincingly. Not quite convincingly. "For whom?" he asked. "For everyone. They have their letter. I have his face." He nodded, though he knew she would not be finished with her resentment. People carried bitterness the way they carried photographs, pressed flat, protected from light, taken out only when the room was empty. But she had at least allowed the frame to stand again. That was something. On his way out, he met Jean coming up, the scarf knotted at her chin. They passed on the stair without words, only a brief acknowledgement in their eyes, like two travellers pausing on opposite sides of a bridge. Outside, the wind had picked up, dragging the clouds across the pale sky and scattering grit into the corners of the street. Back in the cafe, he took his place by the window, the umbrella leaning as ever against the leg of his chair. The bartender brought him a glass without asking, setting it down with the quiet respect of someone who had learned not to inquire too much. Through the fogged glass, Maigret watched the street as if it might reveal something he had missed. He was not waiting for suspects anymore. He was watching the way ordinary life crept back to fill the cracks left by extraordinary secrets. Ruel appeared briefly, his thin shoulders hunched against the wind, carrying under his arm a parcel that might have been books or perhaps nothing at all. He went into the baker's, bought a loaf and vanished again. Not a criminal, not a conspirator, just a man whose hands mended things others had torn. By late afternoon, the cafe had filled with workers taking the edge off the day. Smoke hung thick, conversation rising and falling in waves. Maigret sat among them, a heavy island of stillness, his pipe glowing faintly. He thought of Claire, the girl, reading the letter at last in private. Perhaps she would weep, perhaps she would laugh bitterly, perhaps she would fold it carefully and put it away. Whatever she did, it would be hers, not hidden behind another's frame. That was all an inspector could arrange in the end. Not justice, not even truth, but the return of things to their rightful owners, however flawed. As evening fell, he walked home slowly, his coat buttoned tight against the wind. At dinner, Madame Maigret spoke of Sunday again, of Mo and her sister's hens, of a recipe she wanted to try. He listened, grateful for the steadiness of her voice, for the way domestic life could continue, even while others' lives were being rearranged by letters discovered and promises broken. He smoked his pipe by the window afterward, the city lights blurred by the mist, and thought of the empty frame that had started it all. It had seemed absurd at first, a trifle hardly worth his time, yet inside its pale rectangle lay a history that had outlived both war and silence. He knew there would be no more visits from Jeanne, no more trembling hands over coffee cups, no more denials from Madame Javet. The affair was finished in the eyes of the world, and even in the files of the police judiciaire it would barely be a line. But for the three women, the sister, the lover, the daughter, it had been everything. When he put out his pipe and prepared for bed, the faint drizzle had begun again, whispering against the glass. He stood a moment longer, listening. It seemed to him that the rain had borne witness to all of it, the photograph removed, the letter hidden, the scarfed woman waiting outside doors, the umbrella left behind, the girl lifting her father's words for the first time. The rain had no judgment. It simply fell as it always had, as it always would, and Maigret, weary but calm, let it speak for him. The drizzle turned steady again overnight, rattling softly on the window panes, so that when Maigret stirred in the early grey light it seemed the world outside had not moved at all since yesterday. He rose heavily, aware of his bones, and dressed without haste. Madame Maigret laid his breakfast quietly, remarking only that the butcher's boy had said there might be a shortage of good cuts before the weekend. He nodded, not really hearing, his mind still circling the Rue du Chemin Vert and the faces that had looked at him across coffee cups. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the day began like any other. Files thick with petty quarrels and missing purses piled on his desk, and a constable brought word of a brawl at Les Halles that would need sorting before noon. But Maigret was not quick to bury himself in routine. He sat with his pipe unlit, staring at the folder that contained his terse report on the missing picture, and felt the hollowness of such words. They disguised more than they revealed. By Chiume. Mid-morning, Vernou appeared, looking uncomfortable, his notebook clutched under his arm. "Chief," he said, "the girl Claire came by. She asked for you, said she wouldn't trouble you at home. She seemed uneasy." "Uneasy how?" "As if afraid someone might take what she had only just been given." Maigret tamped his pipe and finally struck a match. "She's not wrong. When words are hidden long enough, someone always wants them hidden again." He stood, shrugged, into his coat. "Where is she now?" "I told her to wait in the corridor." Claire was there, standing awkwardly by a bench where policemen came and went without noticing her. Her scarf was damp from the rain, her eyes brighter than they ought to have been. When she saw Maigret, she straightened, as though bracing against judgment. "They followed me," she said simply before he asked. "Who?" "A man, I don't know him. I came out of our street this morning and he was behind me. When I turned into the boulevard, he was still there. He didn't speak, only stopped when I stopped, walked when I walked. He had a coat too thin for the weather." "Ruel?" Maigret asked. She shook her head. "No, not him. Someone else, older." She hesitated, then added, "When I came inside here, he crossed the street. I saw him through the glass." He nodded slowly. "What do you carry?" "With you?" "The letter." She touched her bag instinctively. "I couldn't leave it at home. My aunt, she might... I don't know." "You'll leave it with me," he said firmly. "For now." He held out his hand, and after a moment she surrendered. The envelope, her fingers clinging to it a heartbeat too long. "You'll have it back, but safer here." She swallowed and nodded, relief mingling with doubt. When she had gone, he sat with the letter in his palm. Its presence felt heavier now. As if once revealed, it had grown into something others would chase. He thought of Madame Javet's stiff face, of Jeanne's tired defiance, of the way Ruel's hands hovered like a penitence over the fragile paper, and he thought of the unknown man in the thin coat, shadowing a girl through the rain. By afternoon, he was back in the café across from Rue du Chemin Vert. The bartender greeted him with a look that meant something had happened. "Your woman with the scarf was here earlier," he said, wiping a glass. "She met a man. Not the one with the umbrella, taller with a limp. They sat only a minute. She gave him nothing, but when she left he followed her as far as the bakery. Then he turned back." "A limp," Maigret repeated. "Yes, left leg, I think." He walked as though the ground resented him. Maigret sipped his beer slowly. A man with a limp. War had left many of them walking reminders of old battles. If the letter had spoken of promises made to Jeanne, perhaps there had been someone else in that story. Someone denied. Someone who had waited and grown bitter in the shadow of Henri Javet's photograph. Such men did not vanish. They lingered, carrying their wounds like passports. As the street darkened toward evening, he crossed to the green door on Rue de Pasteur Wagner. The concierge with the bad throat emerged from his lodge at the sight of him, coughing into his fist, the limping. "Man," Maigret said without preamble. "You've seen him." The concierge's eyes narrowed. "He asked for Ruel once, months ago. Said they had worked together binding ledgers in the army. Ruel told me after that he didn't want visitors. The man had eyes that searched too much." "Name?" The concierge shrugged. "He didn't give it. Called himself a comrade, but you know how men are, comrades one day, ghosts the next." Upstairs, Ruel opened the door reluctantly, the smell of paste and leather thick around him. His hands trembled faintly when Maigret mentioned the limp. "You know him," Maigret said. Ruel sat heavily, rubbing his forehead. "His name is Vautrin. He was with Henri Javet in the regiment. They were close once. But something happened. A quarrel over the girl, Jeanne. Vautrin had thought he believed she belonged to him. Then Henri wrote her letters. After Henri died, Vautrin said he had been betrayed twice, by a friend and by fate. He carries that still. He comes to me sometimes, thinking I can give him what was never his. And if he learns of the letter? Ruel's eyes darkened. He will want to destroy it, not for law or honor, but because it proves Henri's word was stronger than his silence. The pieces settled heavily in Maigray's mind. The limp, the shadowing of Claire, the bitterness of decades left to ferment. This was no crime of greed, but of jealousy that had refused to die. The photograph had never mattered. It was the words hidden behind it, words that robbed Vautrin of the illusion. He had carried all his life. When Maigret left, the rain had begun again in earnest, streaking the lamps and drawing reflections along the cobblestones. He walked back to the cafe, the envelope secure in his inside pocket. He knew the man would come soon, drawn as if by a thread. And indeed, as he sat with his beer untouched, he saw him. A tall figure at first glance, but bent by his limp. His coat collar high, his hat pulled low. He paused on the step across the street, as though deciding whether to enter the cafe or to wait outside in the rain. His eyes, restless, searched the windows, and when they landed on Maigret, they held there for a long moment. Then, with the resignation of someone who has nothing left to lose, he crossed the street. The door opened, letting in a draught of wet air. The bartender stiffened, but Maigret raised a hand slightly, calming him. The man approached slow, deliberate, the limp making his progress uneven. He stopped at Maigret's table. "You have it," Vautrin said, his voice flat, scarred by years. "I have it," Maigret agreed, not moving. "It belongs nowhere," the man said, bitterness pressing against each word. "It should never have been written. He took her from me. Even dead he takes her. Give it to me." Maigret studied him in silence, the smoke from his pipe curling upward like a patient refusal. The cafe had grown quiet, men leaning on elbows, to watch without appearing to. Outside, the rain drummed steadily as though urging the moment forward. "No," Maigret said at last. The word was calm, final, heavier than any explanation. Vautrin's mouth twisted, half anger, half despair. He stood for a moment longer, as though weighing whether rage could make him strong enough to seize what was denied him. But the limp betrayed him. His body knew better. At last he turned away, limping back into the rain without another word. Maigret watched him disappear into the blur of water and night. Then he reached for his beer, finally drinking, the taste flat and warm. The bartender came, hesitant. "You'll follow him?" "No," Maigret said. "The rain will do it. Men like him dissolve. All that remains is the bitterness, and bitterness is not a crime." He leaned back in his chair, the envelope still resting in his coat, safe for now, and let the steady sound of the rain carry the story toward its inevitable end. The rain held, its line across the window for a long time after Vautrin left, a steady gauze that made the street lamps tremble in their halos. Maigret did not move at once. He finished his beer, put the pipe back in his pocket unlit, and sat with the weight of the envelope, a familiar pressure under his coat. The cafe had begun to breathe again, chairs scraping, spoons against glass. No one asked him anything. Men, who knew when a thing had passed their table and decided to go elsewhere. He slept as men sleep when the day has been ordinary to the eye and heavy to the mind. Flat on his back, hands on the chest, like a man in a photograph. In the morning, the sky had rinsed itself to a weak white. He left home with a kiss to Madame Maigret's cheek and a promise to bring onions if he remembered. At the quay, he put the envelope in the bottom drawer, turned the key, and felt no safer for having done it. By 10, the corridor had its traffic. A thief who wasn't a thief wanted to return a wallet to a woman who wasn't grateful. A man from the prefecture came with a paper for a paper. Maigret let the morning build around him until the tap at the door came, a dry, apologetic sound, as if the knuckles had been taught to knock by discipline rather than by impulse. Vautrin stood there, hat off, hair combed with water, the limp less theatrical by daylight and therefore more honest. "You refused me," he said, not sitting. "It was right. I behaved badly. I have nothing to threaten with. I only want to speak in a room where the furniture is official." Maigret gestured to the chair. Vautrin lowered himself into it with the care of a man who knows pain is a creature that wakes if you drop it. He kept his hands on his hat brim, as if steadying. "A wheel, I told myself for years," he began, eyes on the hat. that Henri had no intention of keeping her, that he was all talk, a smile for the girls at the canteen and nothing behind it. I told myself she would see that a man with work, even poor work, is better than a photograph. When he died, I told myself the dead had made room for the living. The living meaning me. He gave a small, mirthless sound that did not reach the throat. Your letter says otherwise. You have not read it, Maigret said mildly. I do not need to, Vautrin answered, and for the first time looked up. His eyes were pale where the rain makes a color paler. I saw his hand once on a Sunday when we were all made to write, to the ones we pretended we had. He wrote quickly, as if worried the train would leave without his words. Jeanne kept her letters. I kept only the ache of them. He swallowed. After the war, I went to the Javed women. I took a bottle because that is what one carries when one has nothing else to offer. The mother had a letter in her apron pocket. She said a woman had come to the door, a silly thing with a hat box, and asked for her due. She said she would see. The girl starved on the step before she gave her the right to carry our name. I said nothing and too much. I said perhaps the best place for promises was where people could look at them and feel brave and not read them and feel bound. The frame was on the mantel. I said nothing and too much. He had not cried, that was not his way. But something in the face went slack, the way ropes slacken when a load is set down. He sat with his hands open on the hat, as if he had been asked to show they were empty. The radiator ticked. A clerk outside laughed at something meant to be kept. To himself. You want me to destroy what proves you wrong, Maigret said. It was not unkind. I wanted it last night, Vautrin said, so that the story I told myself would not end with me as a fool. Today I want to see it and not touch it. Then I will walk away and perhaps my limp will be lighter. Maigret turned the key and brought out the envelope. He did not pass it across. He laid it where the other man could see without moving closer than his honesty would bear. The brown ink had the peculiar dignity of things that were made in haste and then asked to last. Vautrin leaned until the chair creaked. He did not read. The eyes could not in that slant of light. He looked at the shape of the words, the loops that belonged to a young man, the uneven line where the pen had caught on the fibre because there had not been time to dip it again. He breathed once through the nose as a horse does when it decides. Not to shy, thank you, he said, still not reaching. I have been wrong in a way that has nothing to do with crime. That is the worst kind. There is a girl, Maigret said. A woman. She will keep the paper. It will be hers, not as a weapon, but as an end to imagining. Vautrin nodded. I tried to live on imagining, and it made me mean. He stood with the old care, hat in hand still as if to reassure himself that something belonged to him. At the door he hesitated. You will say nothing to Jeanne. I will say nothing you cannot say yourself, Maigret replied. I have nothing that would not sound like an excuse, Vautrin said, and went, the limp a metronome for a life that had kept the wrong time and knew it. When the door shut, the room exhaled. Maigret put the envelope back, turned the key, and sat a while with his pipe unlit. He thought of the mother in her apron, of how easily a sentence spoken in a kitchen can become a law that lasts decades. He thought of Ruel warming a knife, of Marthe Javet polishing the frame as if diligence could replace permission, of Jeanne sitting in cafes as the rain wrote the same line over and over on the glass. He did not send for anyone. He went to Boulevard, Voltaire instead, and stood again in the photographer's dim room, where the woman behind the counter had a new fray on her cloth, and the ledger lay open at the month when everyone had been poor and in love. He asked for nothing, but she brought the book for him to touch with his eyes. We keep names, she said. We do not keep people. At Rue Oberkampf, Ruel handed him the copy for Marthe, a photograph so flat it had no perfume of thickness and yet honest. You might advise them, Ruel said, not to hang the letter itself. Paper grows old quickly in air. Some things prefer the dark. Most things, Maigret said. He returned to the café and sent Vernou with the copy to the Rue du Chemin Vert. Give it to her, he said. Say it is from no one. If you add my name, it will be too heavy. The young inspector went with a zeal that might one day ripen into tact. Jean and Claire came in not long after, as if the café had struck their hour without asking. They looked better tired than the day before. One sleeps when one knows what. One can stop fearing. Maigret placed the envelope on the table. He did not push it forward like a prize. He set it as one sets a plate for someone who has been expected. "It stays with you," he said to Claire. "Your father wrote it without knowing he was writing to a daughter. That does not lessen his hand." Claire kept both hands in her lap. A second, then lifted one as if it had been given a new task and did not want to get it wrong. She slid the envelope to her side and did not open it. She understood enough to know that not reading can sometimes be the proper way to keep a thing. Jeanne looked at Maigret, then away. "He came?" she asked quietly. "The other one. He came," Maigret said, and the simple past was all the story required. "He understands more now than yesterday." "He will not come to us," Jeanne said. It was not a question. No. Maigret agreed. They sat a minute with the warmed quiet that comes after storms that broke no windows. The bartender refilled nothing because nothing needed refilling. Outside, a gust pushed rain along the gutters and made the café door quiver on its springs. "When you are ready," Maigret said at last, "take the letter to a drawer where air does not make it old. Make 2 copies, one for your child if you have one someday, and one for whoever tells you too loudly that they own the past. Give Martha the picture and the right to keep her frame without thinking it a barricade. That will do." Jeanne nodded. She rose, then put a hand on his sleeve with a pressure so light it could have been only the weight of linen. "You waited," she said. "No one waits any more." "It is my profession," he said, which was true and not all the truth. They left and the café reassembled itself around the empty chairs. Vernou returned with the news that Martha had taken the copy and said nothing except that the mantle looked less bare. He gave the report the deputy chief wanted, written in the neutral weather of administration. "Personal matter concluded," it read. "Property reconciled." It was not wrong. It was also not what had happened. At dusk, Maigret walked once more to the green door. The concierge with the bad throat was folding newspapers into cones for ashes. "Your limping friend does not come," he croaked. "The stair misses him and does not." "The stair will forgive," Maigret said. Upstairs a kettle sang somewhere, a note too high for a room that had known so many low ones. He did not ring anyone's bell. He stood at the window at the end of the landing and looked into the courtyard where a cat nosed the wet. The rain had thinned to a suggestion. In a week, Paris would forget this weather and begin another. The letter would sleep. The frame would be dusted on Sundays. The girl would fold and unfold her name until it wore less like a borrowed coat. On his way home, he bought onions, remembering without remembering why. Madame Maigret took them with a small sound of satisfaction and said something about Mo that he did not catch, because he was listening to the water find its level in the pot. He ate, drank, and afterwards sat at the window while his pipe made a small star in the dimness. Across the street, a man shook a rug and beat out of it a history that looked like dust and was. A woman pushed a pram with no child in it, only shopping, and yet her hands had not learned another grip. He thought of the first ring at the Rue du Chemin Vert and of the young inspector's voice on the telephone. Uncertain, because he had not yet learned that nothing is trifling if people have given it the job of carrying what they cannot say. He thought of the rubber band on the umbrella and the circular little swirls on glass where a towel had hurried. He thought of a soldier writing with a train in his ear. He did not feel clever. He felt, as he often did at the end of the real cases, that he had been allowed to stand in a room while human weather rearranged itself, and that his task had been to keep the window from being opened too wide or shut too tight. Before bed, he took up his pen and added one sentence to the report, then crossed it out and wrote it again in his own notebook, where no clerk would file it. Letter returned to its climate. It pleased him, the way certain quiet phrases please a man for no reason he can justify. He slid the notebook back into the drawer. The rain had given up. The city held its breath between showers. He turned out the light and let the dark return to its work. The week passed with the slow inevitability of rain drying from cobblestones, leaving only faint stains where the water had been. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the case was no longer spoken of, replaced by new thefts, fresh quarrels, more urgent voices clamoring for attention. Yet Maigret carried it still, as he often did with such quiet affairs, Cases that left no headlines, no trophies, only human truths folded neatly into the fabric of the city. One afternoon, when the air was cool and clear after a night storm, he walked again to Rue du Chemin Vert. The concierge, busy with her broom, gave a sniff that could have meant satisfaction or boredom. Madame Javet received him in her parlour. On the mantel, the photograph stood straight within its frame once more. The brass tabs had been pressed down firmly, and the glass bore no new smudges. The clock ticked with a steadier rhythm, as though the house itself had settled. She offered him coffee without hesitation, a sign of truce rather than warmth. He accepted. "They came," she said, meaning Jean and the girl. "They brought me a copy, as you said. It is not the same, but it will do." Her fingers touched the frame lightly, not possessively this time, but with a kind of tired acceptance. "He belonged to more than me, I suppose." "I see that now." Maigret nodded. "Sometimes it takes a long time for the living to forgive the dead." When he left, the air outside felt lighter, though the street was no different. Across at the café, Jeanne and Claire were seated by the window, speaking quietly, the envelope no longer in sight, but resting somewhere safe between them. They saw him, and Jeanne inclined her head in acknowledgement. Claire managed a small, shy smile, as if to thank him without words. He raised his pipe slightly, the gesture almost a benediction, and went on his way. Later, back at the quay, he completed his report at last, reducing everything to a few dry lines that would satisfy the files. Stolen property recovered. Domestic. Dispute resolved. No further action required. The words meant nothing, but they would endure. What mattered lay elsewhere. In the returned frame, the girl's knowledge of her father's promise, the easing of a bitterness that had outlived the man who caused it. That evening at home he sat by the window with his pipe while Madame Maigret mended a button. The rain had ceased, leaving the city damp but calm. Lamps glowed along the boulevard, their light softened by the mist. He thought of Vautrin limping away into the night, swallowed by the rain, of Ruelle bent again over his bindings, fixing what could be fixed, of Marthe Javet dusting her mantle, no longer polishing away the absence but accepting its place. He thought of Jeanne finally at rest, and of Claire folding the letter into her future. Maigret drew on his pipe and let the smoke drift toward the glass. Another case would come tomorrow, with its own peculiarities, its own quiet sorrows. But, for tonight, the city seemed to exhale around him, and he was content to exhale with it. The rain had written its story and faded, leaving behind only the soft gleam of wet stone and the silence of promises kept at last.